Welcome back to the realm of Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today marks our continuation through Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Engage deeper with these insightful teachings alongside us. Crafted meticulously by the team at Buddhist Audio Bookshelf, this audiobook serves to disseminate Buddha's wisdom. Your backing in proliferating these teachings is pivotal. Subscribe, like, and share to broaden the impact of these transformative messages. Let's collectively foster a world enriched by the profound guidance of Buddha. Relax and absorb, allowing these teachings' essence to resonate within as we traverse this enlightening path. Let's get started with Right Livelihood. August 7, 2006. Of all the factors in the path, right livelihood is probably the one that receives the least attention. And so it's good to pay some attention to it. The definition in the canon is pretty simple. You avoid wrong livelihood and you support yourself with right livelihood. It's hardly even a definition at all, because it doesn't explain the term. In other parts of the canon, though, the Buddha does describe right livelihood for monks. No hinting, no scheming, no trading gain for gain. In other words, you don't promise to give a reward to someone who gives something to you. This is the way the monks live. It's very different from the way lay people live. For lay people, trade is the basic mode of livelihood. If you give me something, I'll give you something in return. That's the basic mode of operation throughout lay life. But when you ordain, you drop that. And you don't even hint, don't even scheme. You don't even try to plan to get anything out of anybody or think how can you attract support, or how can you attract donations from people. There are lots of rules to make sure that one monk, say, doesn't try to monopolize all the generosity of the lay people at the expense of the other monks. So that's right livelihood for monks. It's a very pure livelihood. You take what you get. You content yourself with what you get. It's purely an economy of gifts. For lay people, there are a couple of examples in the canon where the Buddha says to avoid certain kinds of trade. Trading in poison, trading in meat, trading in weapons, intoxicants, trading in slaves. The Buddha says to avoid these things entirely. And then there are a couple cases where people come to the Buddha and say that they have been told that their particular livelihood actually has a place for it in heaven. In one instance, it's a professional soldier who comes and he's been told by his teachers who taught him the trade of being a soldier, that if you die in the battle, you're going to the heaven of the heroes who die in battle. He wants to know what the Buddha has to think about that. The Buddha avoids the answer. The guy asks him 3 times, and the Buddha finally says, well, since I can't get past you, okay, I'll tell you. If you're in the midst of a battle and are consumed by the thought of trying to kill other people, either from greed, anger or delusion, that intention is an unskillful intention. If you die with the state of mind, you go to hell. Or if you have the wrong view that this is going to take you to heaven, you still go to hell. You go to the hell for people who die in battle. Instead of going to heaven, it's a hell. There's another case where an actor comes and he says, I've been told that when you entertain people, give them enjoyment, you go to the heaven of laughter where everybody's enjoying themselves. And he wants to know what the Buddha thinks about that. Again, the Buddha avoids answering until the guy asks him 3 times. The Buddha says, okay, I can't get past you, so I'll tell you. If you're trying to inspire passion, aversion, and delusion in people through your acting, then when you die, you go to the hell of laughter, i.e., they're not laughing with you, they're laughing at you. So if your livelihood involves inspiring greed, anger, and delusion either in yourself as you do it or in other people, think about advertising all the greed that it inspires in some people. It's not right livelihood. That's the question of right and wrong livelihood outside. But then there's the whole question of how you support your mind. In other words, by engaging in right livelihood, there are many times you have to go without. Especially as monks, you can't try to figure out ways of attracting donations. You can't figure out ways of scheming or hinting or promising rewards for people who give donations, in terms of giving them things in return. That means that there are going to be times when you have to do without. When that happens, it's important to think of your other means of support. You support the mind. The mind does have its own belongings, all the karma it creates. Those are the belongings of the mind. That's what supports the mind. And just as your physical belongings can either weigh you down or support you, in the same way your actions weigh you down or support you. When you think about the fact that your livelihood is not placing a burden on other people that they don't want, it gives energy to the mind. The knowledge that your livelihood is pure, the knowledge that your livelihood is honest. All of these things give energy to the mind. These are belongings for the mind. Ajahn Lee gives the example of the mind being like a tape recorder. Nowadays, of course, it would be an MP3 recorder. Whatever you do, it just gets recorded, gets stashed away in the mind. So think about what you're stashing away. If you're stashing away honesty, or are stashing away any of the good qualities of the mind, this is a support. These things will actually contribute to the long life, the health of the mind. It's just the opposite of the principle where you gain your livelihood in ways that are unskillful. Even though you may have lots of things are not really supports for the mind at all. If you get them in a way that's dishonest and you start thinking about the dishonest things you did to get them, these things actually weigh the mind down. So even though you may have material belongings that seem to support the body, they are a weight on the mind, they eat away at the mind. So remember, the important place to look for the livelihood of the mind. Right livelihood, on the inner level, is what you're doing, the quality of what you're doing. Does it support you? Does it give you energy? When you can reflect on the things that you've done skillfully, that really is energizing for the mind. So keep this in mind. If things get difficult physically, look at the state of the world right now. It seems like there are people who want to destroy civilization. They want to make life difficult for other people. And it's the nature of human civilization that no matter how good it gets, it's going to have to deteriorate. It could happen in our lifetime. So make sure you have your values straight, so that when it gets difficult to gain support for the body, at least you've got support for the mind. And that's much more important because that's the treasure you take with you when you go. The image they give in the canon is that the good actions you've done are like relatives waiting for you on the other side. They're happy to see you, they come up and they greet you. They support you. That's much better than being weighed down by what you have to do in order to scrape together some support for the body, which is going to die anyhow. Another image they give in the canon is throwing a rock in the water. No matter how much you try to pray for the rock to rise up, it's just not going to rise up. As opposed to floating oil on water. The oil will float on top of the water. No matter how much you curse it, it won't sink. So keep this in mind if things ever get difficult physically. The supports for the body are not your true treasures. The treasures that are lasting are the ones the mind records away through its actions. So make sure you're recording good actions, things that will support the mind, energize it, provide for its health and livelihood. Things like the meditation we are doing right now. Ajahn Suwat was once asked why we didn't have a god in Buddhism. In fact, the guy who said this said, "You guys would have a really good religion here if only you had a god, so you'd have a sense of support when things get difficult." Ajahn Suwat's response was really good. He said, "If there were a god who could ordain that when I eat, everybody in the world gets full, I'd bow down to that god." In other words, the nature of supporting the body is that everything just goes into the body and disappears, as opposed to the support that you make for the mind. Not only do you benefit, but the people around you benefit as well if you support the mind wisely. So that sense of well-being, the sense of self-esteem that comes from knowing you've done something right, that's an important part of the path. Not only are you energized by it, but it also energizes the people around you. That's a real treasure. So make sure that you treasure it. The Thinking Cure. September 18, 2006. The Buddha once said that he got started on the right path of practice when he learned to observe his thinking, noticing which kinds of thoughts were skillful, which kinds were unskillful. In other words, which kinds of thinking lead to harm, Which kinds of thinking didn't lead to harm? Notice that. He didn't say he got on the path when he learned to stop thinking. He got on the path when he learned to observe his thinking and to see it as part of a causal process. This is important because a lot of meditation has to do with thinking. There's a popular misconception that meditation means not thinking at all. But if you look at all the descriptions of the Noble Eightfold Path, you see that they all start with right view. Then they continue with right resolve. In other words, they start with thinking. Learning how to think in the right way. This is why we have Dharma Talks. If thinking weren't involved in the practice, if your views weren't important in the practice, Dharma Talks wouldn't serve any function. You'd have to teach by example by not saying anything at all. But meditation doesn't work that way. You have to learn how to think in the right way as you come to meditation. This is a thinking cure. In psychotherapy they have talking cures. And they note how amazing it is. Sometimes simply talking over a neurosis, getting it out in the open, learning to be very clear about the presuppositions behind it can disband it. It loses its power. In a similar vein, meditation is learning how to watch our thoughts, to be very clear about how the mind thinks. Learn how to bring up its assumptions. The unexpressed assumptions are the ones just barely expressed so that you can see them in the light of day. Then you can see what kinds of thinking you really do believe in, what kinds of thinking you don't. Often you'll find that things that have been having the most power over the mind are the ones that, if you really look at them, don't really make any sense at all. So it's important as you meditate that you have a sense of the role and power of thinking in the meditation. For example, as we're doing breath meditation, try to get the mind to settle down with the breath, get concentrated on the breath. As the Buddha said, every state of concentration depends on a perception, a mental label you create, a little message you can carry from one moment to the next, one that you can remember, that you can be mindful of. Here that message is breath. So what is your concept of the breath? How do you relate to it? We talk about forcing the breath, but the breath isn't the sort of thing you can force. You can force the blood to different parts of your body. And that's often what we do when we think we're moving the breath around in the body. We're simply changing the way the blood circulates. We can get ourselves into some pretty strange physical states this way, and they can have an effect on the mind because you're forcing the blood too much. In other words, you're playing around with what the texts call the liquid element or the liquid property, and you've missed the breath entirely. But this is the way we often relate to our body. An emotion comes up and a lot of the physical side of the emotion has to do with the fact that our blood circulation has changed. When we were little children, before we learned any language, we ran up against pain, and one of the ways we dealt with it was try to force it away. We actually used a change in the blood circulation to try to force the pain away. That became our instinctive way of relating to the body. To force the blood to circulate in a different way. This is why so much of the imagery of psychotherapy is from hydraulic mechanics. Emotions get pushed underground, and then they force their way here, force their way there, the same way that liquids under pressure get forced around and break the pipes. But as a meditator, you've got to realize there are other ways of relating to the energy in the body. In fact, the only way you can really get in touch with the breath is to reconceive the whole way you relate to the body. The best way to deal with the breath is simply to think. Allow. Think of the breath going down the back. You don't push it down the back. You allow it to go. When you think of the breath going to the different parts of the body, don't try to push it. You allow it. If you push it, you're pushing the blood. You're pushing the liquids in the body. What you can do is just think. Open up, open up. Keep your wrists relaxed, keep your ankles relaxed. All your joints, keep them relaxed. Think of opening up the passages by which the breath can flow. You can't make the breath flow. It's something it's going to do on its own once you've opened the channels. So you maintain the thought of just breath. You might want to picture the body and, say, think of breath going down the back, out the legs, down the shoulders, out the arms, spreading out in all directions. You can keep that picture, that perception in mind, but try not to force anything in the body. As soon as you start forcing things, it gets difficult. This is part of the thinking cure. Getting a new conception of the breath and learning to hold on to that conception. And you need a new conception of yourself as well, of what you can do. Often this is a huge part of the meditation. I remember looking through collections of Dharma talks from the forest ajahns, and this applies to all of them. So much of their talks is spent not in explaining things, but in encouraging, reminding people that this is something you can do. You can relate to the body in a different way from the way you've been doing it. You can relate to the mind in a different way. As the Buddha once said, if it weren't possible for people to change their ways from unskillful to skillful, he wouldn't have taught the practice of developing skill. It wouldn't have served any purpose. But it is possible. When you've been doing something unskillful, you can change. You realize that there is another way of doing things, and that you're capable of doing it. This requires a certain amount of imagination. That's the beginning of any change in your behavior. Allowing yourself to imagine that you can change the way you behave. This is another part of the thinking cure. This applies to all aspects of the practice. You start with generosity. When you make up your mind to give a gift, you're imagining yourself as someone with something to spare. Up to that point, you may have been thinking that you're hungry and lacking, and all you could think about was gaining, getting. But when you allow yourself to think that you have more than enough, you can give. And you begin to realize that this has very little to do with how much you may have materially. Poor people can often be more generous than rich people because they have a different idea of enough. When you make this simple change in your thinking, you put yourself in a new place. A place with more dignity, a place of more inner worth. The gift of forgiveness is the same sort of thing. Someone else has harmed you. If all you can think about is how much you're a victim, you make yourself a smaller person. But if you think of yourself as large-hearted enough to forgive, you suddenly become a larger person. That gives the mind more space to move around. And so on down the line. You learn that you can observe the precepts. You learn that you can meditate simply by changing the way you think about yourself and your capabilities. So remember that this is a thinking cure. There do come parts of the practice where you learn not to think, but you have your reasons for not thinking. You're doing it with specific aims in mind, so be clear about your aims and where your aims come from. What are the values that lie behind them? What's your understanding of suffering and the end of suffering that lies behind how you do things? Make sure to straighten out your thoughts. Once you straighten out your thoughts, realizing how suffering comes about and how you can put an end to it, you've got everything you need to put an end to it. It's simply a matter of allowing yourself to think in those ways. Notice that the emphasis is on allowing. You don't have to force yourself. You allow something better than what has been happening to happen. Ajahn Fuang once said that if we could force our way into nirvana, everybody would have arrived there a long time ago. But it's not something you can do by force. You ultimately get there only through discernment. And discernment starts with learning how to think in the right way. It doesn't cost anything, doesn't require a lot of energy. Just allowing yourself to think in skillful ways. That can turn you around right there and head you in the right direction. So before you stop thinking, learn how to think in ways that are really helpful. Allow yourself to think in ways that are really helpful, and it will make all the difference in your practice. Energy and efficiency. September 24, 2006. There is a famous story of the young man who was very delicately brought up. So delicately brought up that he even had hair on the soles of his feet. When he ordained as a monk, he tried practicing meditation really hard, sitting long periods of time, doing walking meditation long periods of time. But because his feet were so tender, all that walking got his feet bloody. He thought to himself, "Here I've given all the effort I can, and nothing is coming of it." He thought of disrobing. The Buddha sensed this and appeared right in front of him, and asked him, "Back when you were a layperson, did you play the lute?" The monk said he had. He was skilled at playing the lute. And the Buddha asked him, when you tightened the strings too tight, what happened? It didn't sound right at all. How about too loose? Didn't sound right either. And the Buddha then said, in the same way, you should tune your energy to the point where it's just right, and then tune the rest of the strings of your practice. In other words, conviction, mindfulness, concentration, discernment. Tune those to the level of your energy. In that way the practice will come out right. So keep this in mind as you're meditating. Look at the level of energy you have. This can be both physical and mental energy, and tune your practice to that level. Everything else has to be tuned to that. In other words, when you're sick, when you're not feeling well, the practice goes one way. You may spend less time putting physical energy into the practice, and you may not be able to gain the levels of concentration or very precise mindfulness that you want, but do the best you can given the circumstances. When your energy level is high, don't be too quick to say, well, I've meditated enough today. It's 11 o'clock, that's my usual time to go to bed, I'll go to bed then. When your energy level is high, stick with it. Tune your practice to the level of energy that you have. And do what you can to increase the energy. This is one of the roles of right mindfulness. Gaining a sense where you're doing the practice inefficiently. It's like increasing the gas mileage on your car. You may have a limited amount of gas, but if the car is more efficient, you can go further. So try to do the practice as efficiently as you can. Look for areas where you're causing yourself unnecessary stress, placing unnecessary obstacles in your way. Clear those away. This is where mindfulness and discernment come in. Mindfulness here including alertness, watching to see what's going on, how things are going with your practice. Use them to look for areas where you're expending wasted energy. There was once a woman, a student of Ajahn Fuang, who had chronic cancer. It was amazing. She would get cancer on one part of the body, they'd take that out, then she found it in another part of the body. This went on for years and years. As far as I know, she is still alive. This started 20 plus years ago. One time, she developed a form of cancer that required radiation, but she was allergic to the anesthesia. So she told the doctors, look, I'm a meditator. I can handle pain. Let me just use my power of concentration. So they tried it, and she got through, but it took all her energy, and left her feeling drained. But she was able to make it through without any anesthesia. Ajahn Fuang went to visit her the next day, and as she told him this, he said, look, you're wasting your energy. Try to use your discernment, too. In other words, get a sense of what's awareness as opposed to the object of awareness, and keep that distinction in mind. Just being able to make that distinction makes it a lot easier to deal with the pain. You don't have to use simply the brute force of your concentration. So an important principle in discernment is learning what to let go of, so that you're not wasting energy. This is especially important as you find yourself physically ill, as you grow old, as you approach death. A lot of wasted energy gets spent in your idea of who you are and what you're responsible for, and what you want to salvage out of all this. If you can remind yourself that the important thing to salvage is the state of your mind, keeping the mind as bright and centered and clear as possible, then you can come through a lot more intact. That's your responsibility, everything else is optional. So even though you may have gotten some use out of identifying with it, but there comes a point in the practice where that becomes an obstacle to any kind of happiness. So before that point comes, you want to learn how to let go, realizing that any concern about the physical state of the body is ultimately going to have to meet up with the fact that the body has to grow old and ill and die, regardless of how worried you are about it. So the worry accomplishes nothing. It becomes a distraction and an unnecessary burden. This is where it's important that you learn how to adjust your sense of who you are and trim it down. It's like trimming down your luggage. You know you're going to have to travel, so carry only what's necessary. It's like going camping. You don't want to carry so much that you can't walk. At the same time, you don't want to have so few provisions that you can't keep yourself going. To begin with, Make sure you just hold on to this ability to be mindful, alert. Get your concentration as solid as you can. In other words, hold on to good qualities. As for your other responsibilities, you have to keep practicing letting them go. Whatever work you've got to do, whatever responsibilities you've got to look after, learn how to let any ideas of those responsibilities down. Learn how to disidentify with the body. You may have to pick it up again at the end of the meditation, but for the time being, just learn how to reflect on it. What in here is something that you can really carry with you, that's really worth carrying with you? It's all physical elements. That list of the 32 parts of the body we chanted just now. Which of those do you want to take with you? They serve their function while the body's alive, but you have to let them all go. Besides, who would want to carry urine around or feces or contents of the stomach or lungs? They're useful while the body's alive, and you want to take care of the body so that it can continue functioning as best as it can, but there will come a time when it just can't do this anymore. So learn how to practice letting it go ahead of time, putting it down. At the very least, you find this is a lot more efficient way of keeping the mind calm, keeping the mind still, clear, bright. It's in this way that discernment is an issue of maximizing efficiency, husbanding your resources, learning what to let go of, so you can hold on to what's valuable. If you try to hold on to too many things at once, you end up dropping them all. It's like juggling too many things in the air all at once. If they're eggs, they'll come splattering down because you can't keep track of them all. Juggle what you can manage. If you can manage one egg, stick with one egg. Don't get too grandiose about what you've got to look after. Keep things trimmed down, pared down, so that you're holding on only to what's essential. That way, you find that the issue of suffering and stress gets more manageable as well. On not being a victim. September 26, 2006. The mind has two basic functions. One is that it registers data coming in through the eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and intellect. And the other is that it wills things, tries to exert an influence on things outside. You might think of these as the passive and the active functions of the mind, or the reactive and proactive functions, because even as the mind is receiving sense data, it's not totally passive. The willing function shapes the things you notice. Sometimes people complain about this. This is one of the reasons why we miss a lot of things in our lives, because we're intent on something else. That is a problem, but it can also be used to our advantage. When the Buddha describes dependent co-arising, well before he starts talking about sensory data, he talks about issues of attention and intention and perception. These factors influence the way you see and hear and experience things. And they can have an influence either for suffering or for the end of suffering. So one of the functions of the path is to learn how to take this willing side of the mind, the side that has ways of attending to things and perceiving things and intending things, and turn that into the path. One of the first things you notice as you meditate is that the mind does tend to switch back and forth between these two functions. The function that's simply registering what's going on and then reacting to that, and the other side that's more proactive. And you can see this very directly in the breath. You can simply watch the way the breath already seems to be, or you can put up a mental picture of how you would like the breath to be. Just a thought, don't try to force it in that direction, just think about it. Think about the breath coursing through the body. As soon as you breathe in, it goes all the way through the body, out to every pore. Just hold that image in mind. After a while, you begin to notice which sensations in the body seem to be corresponding to that picture you have. And you can try encouraging them a little bit. In the beginning it should be just that, a little bit. Don't force things too much. Simply holding that different picture in mind helps you to read your experience in a different way, and also to shape your experience in a way that's more skillful. There may be a pain in the body in some place, and if you breathe in reaction to the pain, many times it just compounds the problem. In this way, the business of both reacting and then being proactive can get into some pretty nasty feedback loops. You feel trapped by a particular pain and then you breathe. in reaction to that sense of feeling trapped, and then it makes the pain worse. You feel even more trapped and everything just spirals down. But you could think in other ways. You see that even though there may be pain sensations in that part of the body, is that all there is in that part of the body? Are there other sensations that are not painful? And your proactive side of the mind begins to change the way you experience things. In some cases, pain is a little hard to tackle straight on, so you work first with the breath. Just think of the breath going well through the body. Think of the body as being light, filled with breath energy, healthy breath energy, luminous breath energy. Just hold that thought in mind. Don't be too impatient to see the results, because after all, the power of thought depends on a consistent, strong thought that you can carry on over time. If you think a little bit and then scramble around looking for results from the thought, that's just a sign of impatience. The thought doesn't have time to exert any power, have any influence. So you learn how to hold that thought in mind, and then look very gradually to see if there are any sensations in the body that would correspond to light breath energy, full breath energy, free-flowing breath energy. Then you can encourage those. This helps you begin to see how much power the mind can have over shaping your experience. In this way you take the willing part of the mind, the proactive part of the mind, and use it to your own advantage. This is why appropriate attention is such an important part of the path. When you could think about things in terms of who you are, what kind of person you are, you're the kind of person who's lazy, the kind of person who never finishes anything, the kind of person who is always a victim of events and that just creates a vicious cycle. This is why the Buddha doesn't encourage you to think about what you are. Instead, he has you think about what's an action. What's the result of an action? What's an intention? What's a skillful intention? You can have all kinds of intentions that free up your mind. There are lots of different ways you can intend to focus on the breath. So find an intention that seems to get good results. It may not be the sort of intention that your preconceived notion of you would ever think of, but why confine yourself? Why make yourself a victim? Why leave yourself in that position? You can learn how to be proactive in a more skillful way. After all the elements of the path are fabricated. Your experience is fabricated through your intentions to begin with. And the path, everything from right view on down to right concentration. These are all fabrications. Right view means learning to look at things in a certain way, learning to look for certain things. So learn to look for some concentration, look for some stillness, look for mindfulness. Their potentials are there. This is the Buddha's basic teaching on dhatu, or element or property. There are physical and mental potentials just waiting to be nourished, just waiting to be activated. But if you sit there as a victim all the time, you'll never activate the proper things. You'll activate all the wrong things. So it's not like you're totally passive. You are shaping events, but at the moment you're shaping them under the influence of an unhealthy feedback loop. Following the path means taking the power of the mind that shapes things and using it for good purposes. Remember the kind of person the Buddha was. He didn't just react to events. He had a very strong sense of what should be. There should be an end to suffering. He focused his conviction on that. And the power of his conviction made a difference. It reshaped his mind, reshaped his experience of things. It shaped his mind until it reached a point where it could see things very clearly in terms of why there is suffering and how you can put an end to suffering. It didn't just happen, it happened through the force of his will. Not blind will, but strong will. So put some conviction into the path. Put some conviction into yourself. Realize that you can fabricate the path in your own mind, put together all the various elements, find the potentials in your mind for mindfulness, alertness, concentration, insight, and develop them. The mind has a power, and the problem is we tend to misuse it. We take that power and use it to create suffering, even though we don't want suffering. We just get into reactive modes, not realizing that we have the power to reshape our experience. Some people shape their experience in ways that are really harmful, but you can also shape your experience in ways that are conducive both to your happiness and the happiness of people around you. conducive to understanding, conducive to release. So learn to take advantage of those powers, because that's the only way you're going to find your way out. Doing, maintaining, using. October 4, 2006. Ajahn Fuang once said that there are 3 stages to concentration practice. The first is learning how to do it. The second is learning how to maintain it. And the third is learning how to put it to use. The doing is not all that hard. Focus the mind on the breath. The breath is right there. You don't have to go scrounging around. You don't have to go to the ends of the earth to find your breath. It's right next to the mind. It's simply a question of learning to be more sensitive to it. That's the hard part of doing it. Having a clear sense of when the breath is coming in, when it's going out, having a clear sense of when you are making it unnecessarily uncomfortable. This involves watching it for a while, and then adjusting it. Think, a little bit longer, think, a little bit shorter. See how the breathing responds, and how it feels as it responds. You can think deeper, think of your whole body all the way down to your toes, breathing in, breathing out. Think of the breath all around the body. Think of the body as being like a big sponge, and the breath is coming in through all the pores. See what way of conceiving the breath feels best. Once you learn how to do this, then the trick is learning how to maintain it. In other words, learning how not to slip off. Learning how to make it comfortable is one of the tricks in learning how to maintain it, because the mind is always looking for food. What we're doing as we're meditating is giving it good food to eat. The sense of comfort that comes with being familiar with the breath helps get the mind more and more inclined to keep coming back. It's like feeding a stray dog. If you give it good food, it's going to come back. The mind has a tendency to stray, but as long as you feed it well, it'll learn more and more that this is a good place to be, a really good place to feed. You can think of the meditation techniques as cooking techniques. You're learning how to feed yourself well. Most of us are the kind of person who just goes rummaging through a garbage heap, then eats whatever, anything that even remotely resembles food. And of course you get sick that way. Sometimes you get good food, sometimes you get bad. You hear stories about restaurants throwing out good food. So sometimes you get good food as you rummage around, but a lot of times it's garbage, really bad garbage. Sometimes it's spoiled. But you keep on eating it because you don't have better food. You don't know how to cook. There was a homeless shelter in DC years back. They went around to all the embassies and all the really good restaurants in DC and just asked for their leftover food. Then they took that and served it at the homeless shelters. All of a sudden the homeless people were eating French food and other exotic dishes. This got the homeless people interested in this kind of food. So right next to the soup kitchen, the people who ran the shelter opened a cooking school where they offered to teach the homeless people how to cook French food and other exotic dishes. As a result, many of the homeless people became really good chefs. They were able to get jobs. This is a good metaphor for our meditation. We learn how to eat well, how to feed the mind well, so we don't have to go running through garbage bins. As the mind learns to feed well, it'll have a tendency not to want to go back to its old ways. This leads naturally to that third step. Using the meditation. The mind needs strength in all kinds of situations, and not only while you're sitting here with your eyes closed. In fact, it especially needs strength when you're dealing with difficult people, difficult situations, situations that give rise to anger, situations that give rise to fear. One of the important uses of concentration is to learn how to keep the mind with the breath in the midst of all kinds of strange situations, all kinds of challenging situations. Instead of leaping out, putting all your awareness outside, you try to keep your awareness centered inside as you deal with whatever's hard to deal with. That way you're coming from a position of strength. So you learn how to stay with the breath and keep the breath comfortable when there's fear, when there's anger, when there's greed, when there's uncertainty, when there are all kinds of things happening around you or happening inside the mind. This is where the concentration really shows its benefits, in that you can keep feeding and strengthening the mind, even in the midst of difficult situations. It's also by learning how to feed the mind in situations like this that you gain more and more insight into the mind. You begin to see how it slips off into its old habits, what tempts it to slip off. Sometimes it's fear. You're afraid if let our old defenses down, this new defense is not going to help us. But as you get more confident in your meditation, you begin to realize this is a much better defense, coming from a position of strength. When the mind is calm and centered, you can think more clearly. Then you learn how to apply it. In situations where you would tend to get depressed, you can cheer up the mind simply by the way you relate to the breath, by the way you relate to your sense of the body. Other times, when the mind seems scattered all over the place, you can learn how to focus it and settle it down, and just keep it really, really solidly based. The Buddha talks about 3 important skills in learning how to keep the mind centered. One is gladdening the mind, another is steadying the mind, and the third is liberating the mind. Whenever you find that a particular feeling has taken over, you learn how to pry the mind loose from its grip, so that the mind is free even in the midst of situations that would normally tie it down or oppress it. So all of these are techniques in the proper care and feeding for the mind. As you feed the mind properly like this, it leads naturally into gaining insight into the various component factors of your meditation. You've learned that in this situation you have to add more pleasure, in that situation you have to change your perceptions, in this situation you have to change the way you think about these things. Well, these are all different aggregates. Feeling, perception, thought constructs. And as you learn how to use them in different ways to deal with different situations, they begin to stand out more clearly because you see them in action, you've used them in action. This is when you're going to gain real insight into them, how you can relate to them in a way that's healthy, rather than just grabbing on and gobbling them down. This is how the mind begins to gain insight into its attachments. Because it sees the component factors, it's learned how to use them in a way that it's really on familiar terms with them, and it's changed its relationship to them. They now become tools rather than things that you would identify with or things that you are constantly chewing on, because you've learned how to feed the mind better, feed it more skillfully. So wherever you are in the practice, if you find that you haven't been able to do the concentration, work on just bringing things together here. Once you've learned how to do it, then learn how to maintain it. And when you learn how to maintain it, the way to gain insight into it is not to try to take it apart yet. It's through learning to apply it to all kinds of different situations, so that you get a really good feel for it. As you gain that feel for it, then the various elements of form, feeling, perception, thought constructs, and consciousness begin to separate out. You can watch them for what they are. Then when you let them go, it's not that you throw them away. You simply learn that you don't have to identify with them. You can pick them up when you need them, put them down when you don't. So this is how the practice of concentration leads to discernment. It teaches you how to eat well, how to feed the mind well, to the point where ultimately it doesn't have to feed anymore. Before your face was born. October 8, 2006. Back when I was in grade school, my mother was chairman of the local school board. It wasn't much of a school. Just 3 classrooms, grades 1 through 8, 60 kids in the school. My first grade teacher, also second and third grade teacher, would stop by at the house every now and then after school to talk things over with my mother. One day they got onto the topic of religion. My teacher was Roman Catholic, and she said something that even when I was 6 years old sounded odd. She said, "Well, if being Catholic doesn't make you better than other people, what good is it?" When you stop and think about it, that's what a lot of people do in this world. They do something because they think it makes them better than other people. Sometimes really crazy things, and often the crazier the activity, the more they have to justify it by saying that it makes them better than other people. That whole mindset, the idea that there are people who are better than others or worse than others or equal to others, is a real trap, because it tends to swing you back and forth between extremes. Either exaggerated self-esteem or exaggerated self-hatred, back and forth, back and forth. And either extreme can make you miserable because the idea of self, of who you are, becomes the big issue in life. You have to do everything you can to shore it up. Then when you find yourself doing things that are not up to that high standard, you feel like a failure. It's good to remind yourself that all those issues are useless. They don't accomplish anything at all. They are what Ajahn Mahabua calls the fangs of unawareness, the fangs of ignorance. This whole issue of conceit. So, remember, we're here meditating not because it makes us better than anybody else, but simply because we want to be happy, and we want to have a happiness that's worth the effort that goes into it. We know that for our happiness to last, it has to be a happiness that doesn't harm anybody else. So we're compassionate to others again, not because it makes us a better person, but because it leads to true happiness. When you keep the issue close to the ground in that way, you don't have to go swinging back and forth between extremes of self-esteem or self-hatred. You can focus simply on the question of whether your happiness is true. Think back on the forest tradition. It was started by sons of peasants up in northeast Thailand, which is the poorest part of the country. And one of the issues Ajahn Mun found himself dealing with again and again was students feeling that they didn't have what it takes to really do the practice. He kept reminding them, "You've got a human body and you've got a mind that doesn't want to suffer. That's all you really need. As for how well you're going to do in the practice, you start where you are." This is one of the reasons why we have the recollection of the Sangha to set our standards right. You look at all the people who have been practicing. There have been men, women, and children, rich people, poor people, healthy people, sick people. And what do they have in common? They wanted true happiness and they were willing to do what it takes. That's all you really need in the practice. The question of whether this makes you better than anyone else is not an issue. That issue of pride tends to come in when you do crazy things and then have to justify them to yourself. You look at all the rituals and rules that used to be a big part of religion and still are part of a lot of religions. They make no sense at all. And yet people keep on doing them because they have the idea that these things make them better than other people. The more unreasonable the rule or ritual, the better they are for their willingness to submit to it. It makes no sense at all. So fortunately in the Buddha's teachings, we don't have rules like that. There are a fair number of rules, but they make sense. You think of the Buddha himself prior to his awakening. When he was trying to find the path, he spent 6 long years in austerities. And what can keep you going through 6 long years of austerities? The idea that the austerities make you better than other people. That's what kept him going for 6 years. But then he realized, all those sacrifices were really for nothing. When you can admit that to yourself, that what you thought made you special was really a waste of time, that's when you learn humility. And when you learn humility, you're ready to learn what you really need to know. So it's good to come to the practice with an attitude of humility. We've been making mistakes all along. It's good to be able to admit the mistakes and to realize that, yes, the mind does need training. Okay. Here is an opportunity to do it. A lot of my training with Ajahn Fuang consisted of his pointing out to me where my weak points were. He wasn't doing it all the time, but he did it at strategic times. He once commented on how Westerners are very stubborn. I had to reflect, well, how many Westerners had he ever met in his life? I think I was the only one. So that was the prime lesson I had to learn. How not to be stubborn. And especially not stubborn in trying to shore up my exaggerated sense of myself. And it really helped. I found myself having to do things that I knew I wasn't really good at. When he was sick, I had to look after him. I wasn't especially good at it, but there was nobody else there. Even though I wasn't doing a perfect job, it was better than nobody helping him at all. That thought was enough to keep me going. So finding myself spending a lot of time working on tasks that I wasn't automatically good at was very good for me. I learned a lot. So it's important that you come to the meditation without the idea that you're already going to excel at it. In fact, one of Ajahn Fuang's strongest terms of criticism was for somebody who thought he was already good before he had even tried it. Ruu Kon Code, Lode Kon Tham was his phrase. You know about things before they happen, and you're excellent before you've even tried your hand. That attitude, he said, sets you up for a fall. All that's asked is that you realize you're suffering, you realize your actions are the important cause for your suffering, and you're willing to learn. Any attitudes that go beyond that set you up for a fall. This is why right view focuses on the issue of suffering. There's no question about making you a better person. It's simply a matter of seeing where there's suffering and where there's a cause of suffering. That motivation goes a lot deeper than your self-image. When you were a little baby, you didn't have a self-image, but you did know you were suffering, and you tried to figure out some way to stop it. So try to dig back into that attitude. That's your face before you were born. You weren't concerned about your face or what it looked like, or what other people would think about what it looked like. There was just that plain old issue of suffering, and you knew that something had to be done about it. Well, here's a path to do something about it. So dig back into that attitude even before your face was born. There was just the issue of suffering and the need to overcome it. When you have that attitude, that's all you really need. And the questions of who you are or how your performance as a meditator reflects on you, those are thoughts to put aside. It's not the case that we don't pass judgment on our actions, but don't let the issue of who you are or how good you are become the object of judgment. There's a difference between being judgmental and being judicious. Judgmental is when you're impatient and you want to come to a decision really fast without putting any effort into finding out the facts of the case. That's judgmentalism. It's harmful. It can lead to a lot of unskillful behavior. Being judicious is when you look at an action to see, does this action really help put an end to suffering or does it cause more suffering? You look at the results and then adjust your next action accordingly. You're not here to judge you as a person, you're here to judge your actions and learn from them. That's being judicious, and that's where your powers of evaluation, your faculty of judgment, really are appropriate. When the issue of your identity or your self-image gets in the way, put it aside. If you find it hard to put it aside, don't say, "This is something really wrong with me," for that gets you into a tailspin. Don't worry about that. Just notice each time it comes and then say, "I know this one, I know where it goes," and do your best to let it go. That's when you can focus on the issue at hand, which is the fact that there is suffering, but there is a potential, there is a path to put an end to it. You've got the opportunity to follow that path. That's all that really matters. The Riddle Tree. October 12, 2006. There's a story of a young American monk ordained in Thailand who went to study with one of the famous forest Ajahns. He asked the Ajahn, "What meditation object is going to bring calm and peace to my mind?" And the Ajahn said, "I don't know. You have to find out." The young monk, hearing, "I don't know," thought it meant that I don't know anything about meditation. He ended up disrobing and going someplace else. But that's not what the Ajahn meant. What he meant was that each of us has to find out what's going to work for us as we meditate. You have to find the object that's most suitable for you, and the best way to relate to it. The whole purpose of developing concentration is to get the mind to settle down, and the way to get it to settle down is to give it a place where it likes to stay settled. What's going to work for you is going to depend on your preferences, on your background, on all kinds of factors that are purely personal. For each of us, the process of developing concentration is an individual thing. So you have to explore. There's no telling exactly what kind of breathing is going to be good for you, or whether there are times when you need to focus on something else instead. Like recollecting the Buddha, recollecting the Dhamma, the Sangha, contemplating of the body, developing thoughts of goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy, or equanimity. It's really a personal matter which of these is going to work for you. There's no one-size-fits-all kind of meditation. Breath meditation comes the closest to a universal object because, after all, we all have a breath, and for all of us it's an important part of our lives. Ajahn Lee recommends taking it as your home base. It's the safest of all meditation objects. But there are times when you need to forage around in other areas. You may find yourself way off in left field and have to find your way back to home base. It may require thoughts of goodwill to get back there, or it may require contemplation of the body. This is something you have to explore for yourself. You have to experiment. You have to learn how to observe to see what works. This is why being observant is so essential to the practice. There's a lot that even the most psychic teacher who can read minds cannot tell you. Ajahn Fuang, who I firmly believe could read my mind and the minds of many other people, said one time, even when you can read minds, you can't tell what's going to work for somebody. How they'll respond to your words, what technique is going to work for them. That's something that they have to find out from within. So, be willing to explore. The same principle applies not only to tranquility but also to insight. There's a sutta called the riddle tree, in which a monk goes to different senior monks and asks them, "What topic do you contemplate in order to gain awakening?" One monk says, "The 5 aggregates," another one says, "The 6 sense media," another one says, "The 6 elements," another one says, "Dependent co-arising." The monk was not satisfied with all these different answers because he couldn't understand why their answers should be so different. So he went to see the Buddha. And the Buddha said that the different answers were like the riddle tree. Apparently there's a tree in India that's kind of like the coral tree. During some seasons it has leaves, and at other seasons it has no leaves at all, and when it has no leaves, it puts out red flowers. It's called the riddle tree because people would say, "What's black like coal in the winter, and red like meat in the spring?" That sort of thing. In other words, the appearance of the tree depends on which time of year you're talking about. In the same way the Buddha said, those different monks answered in different ways, because for each of them a different topic worked, so they talked in line with what had worked for them. So again with regard to insight, there's no one size fits all, no one technique that's going to work for everyone. But if you're observant while you calm down the mind, you begin to see the way your mind works. That's really what you want to know. Some people as they are meditating tend to focus on the issue of feeling. Which feelings are pleasant and how to relate to pleasant feelings. Sometimes you find it easy to stay focused on the breath and have a pleasant feeling alongside the breath, and yet not get distracted. Other people have a real problem. As soon as a pleasant feeling comes up, they drop the breath, run to the pleasant feeling, and end up losing their focus. So in that case, it's going to be important to gain insight into the nature of feeling just to get the mind to settle down. This is how discernment fosters concentration. The typical pattern, of course, is that concentration fosters discernment. But as the Buddha said at one point, to get the mind to settle down to good strong concentration, you need both tranquility and insight. Sometimes you'll depend more on one side than on the other. And it will vary from day to day, from session to session, even from right now to 5 minutes from now. Sometimes when you're starting to get the mind to settle down, it's simply a matter of getting it calm and not thinking about anything else. All you have to do is allow the meditation object to do its work. At other times, you have to understand what you're doing, understand the problems that are arising, learn how to ask questions and attempt answers. So if you notice that you're having a problem slipping off into feelings of pleasure and finding yourself in a nice hazy spot where you don't really know where you are, you're not asleep, but you're not really focused on anything. You know you've got a problem with pleasure. You've got to back up. What can you do? Well, when there's a pleasant rhythm going in the breath, you've immediately got to work on developing your frame of reference, spreading your awareness so that it fills the whole body as you breathe in, the whole body as you breathe out. In other words, you have to change your perception of what you're focused on in order to overcome the attraction to the feeling. This of course then gets you into issues of perception sana in Pali and the role it plays in meditation. In cases like that you may find that the perception becomes the issue on which you have to focus in order to gain insight. This is particularly true as you're shifting from form levels of concentration to the formless. It's a shift in perception. You're right here when you go from, say, focusing on the breath to the point where the breath gets really still. You begin to notice that the boundary of the body begins to disappear. It's as if your sensation of the body is just a cloud of little sensation droplets or little sensation points. And you learn how to stay there for a while. Sometimes you feel afraid of the fact that the breath isn't coming in and out, so you switch back. You have to learn how to not get fooled by that thought construct. When you get past that, then you realize that instead of focusing on the little droplets or points of sensation, you can focus on the space in between. Now if you find yourself suddenly visualizing infinite space, you might get disoriented because your mind stretches out to the limits of infinity of that space. That can be calming, or you might find it disturbing. If it's disturbing, ask yourself, which sense door are you focused on? Are you focused on the visual sense door or the bodily sense door? This is where you switch from issues of the aggregates to issues of the sense doors. Stay simply with the bodily sensation of space. Don't go off into the visualization of space, because the sensation of space can be really pleasant, but the visualization can be disorienting. Then from there on in, it's more an issue of perception again. How are you going to label this experience? You can label it as space, or you can label it simply as infinite consciousness. What's aware of this space? Or the sense of oneness in that infinite consciousness? What happens if you drop the perception of oneness? Nothingness. And what happens when you drop the perception of nothing? And so on down the line. You see that as you get the mind through stages of concentration, you're going to be shifting around among issues of thought fabrication or perception or feeling or consciousness or form, the body, all the aggregates. Or you may find that the issue is how you visualize things as opposed to how you feel them. Those are issues of the sense media. Or you start looking into questions of causation. What are you doing that's causing stress in any particular state of mind? You can't let go of the stress. As the Buddha said, your duty with regard to stress is to comprehend it. But you can figure out what thought formation, what craving is causing it, then you can stop that. It's like finding yourself choking on smoke. You can't put out the smoke, but you can put out the fire. And you find that this kind of analysis works on getting you from one stage of concentration into another. So simply putting the mind through its paces as you get it to concentrate begins to throw up certain issues about the aggregates, sense media, causality. And the issues that you tend to find most fascinating or those that cause you the most trouble. Those are the issues you should focus on for the sake of insight, the insights that first lead to stronger concentration, and then lead to release. No one can tell you beforehand what's going to be the topic on which you can settle down, what kind of breathing is going to be best for you, or when there are times you have to focus on something else in addition to the breath or beside the breath. No one can tell you what's going to give rise to insight. There are all sorts of insight techniques out there, but they're really just sophisticated forms of concentration. The actual insight has to come from seeing how your own mind works. And the best way to see it working is to put it through the laboratory experiment of getting it to settle down. It's like learning how to cook. You can just throw some ingredients in the pot and hope that it comes out okay. Or you can begin to notice what kind of cooking techniques work best, so that the thing gets cooked through without burning. Or if you're fixing a stew of different vegetables, which vegetables have to go in first, which vegetables go in later, so that you don't end up with some undercooked and others overcooked. Looking for the technique that works. That's what gives rise to insight, gives rise to understanding about the food. And the same principle works in the mind. You've got to notice what works and where you have problems, learn how to question the problems and figure out an answer. The basic terms of analysis in terms of the aggregates, the sense media, the elements, dependent co-arising, are there to give you ideas. But as to what's actually going to work in any particular situation depends on your own proclivities, your own powers of observation, your own ingenuity. That's when the insight becomes not just a topic you read about or something you try to impose on the mind, but something that grows naturally out of the practice of learning how to bring the mind to a sense of peace, a sense of calm. The more natural the questions in the experience, the deeper the insight is going to go, And the more relevant it is to the actual suffering that's going on in your mind. So this is why meditation is a process of exploration. You're not trying to clone enlightenment. You're trying to explore cause and effect as they reveal themselves in the process of bringing your own mind to peace. As we draw curtains on today's session, we extend an invitation for ongoing participation. Just as Buddha advocated sharing and supporting his teachings for the greater good, we urge your involvement. Aid in spreading these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your active role ensures these invaluable insights transcend boundaries. Seize this chance to spark positive change and nurture empathy. We eagerly await your presence in future episodes, uniting to illuminate minds and cultivate compassion worldwide.